Joining us here, future Hall of Famer, who was there part of NFL Network's coverage, my colleague Joe Thomas. How are you, Joe?
I'm doing all right, Rich. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, so let's walk through it here. I've done that Thursday night thing for a very, very long time, and I know you're on the field usually a few minutes before getting ready to go on the air. Were you on that side of the field where this happened?
Well, that was actually the big challenge for us from the NFL Network, trying to get ready for the post-game show. As you know, we're kind of hovered around the desk area.
Yep.
We're talking with the producers, talking about what cut-ups we want to see, what stats we're going to talk about. And this happened at the complete other end of the field, and all I could hear was the Joe Buck Aikman call in my ear. And immediately I whipped my head up to try to catch the video board to see if we could see, because it was so far away you couldn't even see what was going on. And as you know, in those NFL stadiums, a lot of times when really bad, egregious stuff is happening, they just cut that video feed out. So we didn't even get to see it or look at it until well after it was over, and we huddled around the little TVs they have right by our set, and we were able to finally get a replay of it right before we went live on air. And that's kind of when you saw it for the first time and were really horrified by the way things unfolded.
So, I mean, how does something like this happen, Joe? Or is it inexplicable? Obviously, you've been in trenches. I just give you the floor on that subject.
Yeah, I think it's inexplicable. I mean, you talk about Myles Garrett. Everybody that knows him will say he's one of the most measured, even-keel guys. You know, he plays hard. He's a Defensive Player of the Year candidate. But to talk about being out of character is really an understatement for something of this magnitude. And really, you could say the game was chippy, but it wasn't like there was all sorts of unnecessary roughness, personal fouls between the different line plays during that game. And so I think it really was something that was almost completely out of left field. And you heard Maurkice Pouncey. It was like he blacked out, Myles Garrett blacked out, and those things happened so quickly that people around him weren't able to bring him back off the ledge in time for things to just completely erupt and unravel.
Well, I'm assuming you. I shouldn't just assume. You agree that the suspension for Myles Garrett was appropriate?
Absolutely. We came on right after the game, and we were speculating, almost in real time that he would likely be done for the rest of the season, 6 games left for the Browns. And that seems like it's probably the minimum at this point from the NFL.
And then what do you think about Pouncey? Because he was reacting. It was a wild reaction, and one that obviously is a bad look. But he's never seen that. I've never seen that. I mean, do you think 3 games is too much for that, Joe?
I thought that actually the NFL was pretty spot on coming down with suspensions today. What we saw from Maurkice Pouncey, we completely understand. Defending your quarterback, defending your teammates, coming to their aid. Myself as a former offensive lineman, I understand the importance of defending your guys, especially that quarterback position. But I think it goes beyond defending your quarterback when the person you're attacking is laying on the ground, has given up, and your other offensive lineman, David DeCastro, is laying on him, and you're stomping and kicking him and trying to punch him. That becomes punitive and a retribution. It's not any longer defending your quarterback. You're trying to get back for your quarterback, and I believe that's why the NFL thought that it's just not a good look, because we consider crossing the line as an NFL family when you start kicking, you're punching, you're stomping, you're swinging helmets. Those are all things that are over the line and beyond reproach. We understand some wrestling matches. We understand things can get heated, pushing and shoving. Those are part of the games. Those are fights that we see all the time. But I think as soon as you elevate it to the kicking and the stomping and the swinging of helmets, that's when you're crossing the line. And I don't mean to try to compare what Pouncey did with what Myles. That's completely not what I'm saying. What Myles did was way beyond anything that Pouncey did. But I believe that Pouncey's suspension was correct because he also crossed the line and went above and beyond just merely defending his quarterback.
Well, Joe, you're, again, a perfect guest to have on right now for many reasons. 1, you were there. 2, you're a future Hall of Fame lineman. And 3, you have been in, as I mentioned, trenches where things can get overheated. So on this front, we're already seeing, first blush, my GOAT friend Charles Woodson tweeted out, are we allowed to look at this from both sides? Emmanuel Acho has been tweeting as well, somebody who's been in the line of fire, if you will, football-wise, about Mason Rudolph essentially tugging on on the head of Myles Garrett to begin with. Do you think Rudolph bears any responsibility whatsoever in all of this, Joe?
Well, I think it's fair to kind of look back on things and say, all right, how did we get to this point? But from my perspective, I look at it like I do when I talk to my kids. My daughter hits my son in the face, and I say that's not acceptable. I don't care what he said to you. I don't care what he did to you to precipitate this. You crossed the line, and that's never acceptable. So while a lot of people want to say Mason Rudolph started it by trying to rip Garrett's helmet off and going back at him a second time, it's not acceptable to ever react the way that Myles did. And so it doesn't matter to me at all what Mason Rudolph's role in starting it or instigating it was whatsoever. And I'll leave that up to the Pittsburgh Steelers to decide how to handle it and who bears the brunt of the blame of why we got to such a terrible moment in the game last night.
What do you think is going to happen in 2 weeks when they see each other again? I mean, 10 days, literally.
Well, it's interesting because this was such an explosive fight, such an explosive end to the game. It's almost like things could possibly simmer out and fizzle out by that time. And there's a great opportunity where cooler heads prevail, and it's a very boring, mundane, standard game because a lot of the players that were involved in this won't even be playing in that game because it is such a recent game. And you talk about the suspensions with Maurkice Pouncey for 3 games and Myles Garrett for the rest of the season. So I could definitely see this being a non-event game. But on the flip side of the coin, there could be a lot of heat from this game still. And there was one thing we haven't even talked about, and that was the Odell Beckham, Jarvis Landry sort of mocking Mike Tomlin with the yawning after the touchdown, and then OBJ and Mike Tomlin kind of jawing back and forth during the game. That was something that was completely overlooked, but definitely would have been a storyline the rest of this game and kind of how that rivalry is taken off a little bit and then moving into 2 weeks. And so it'll be interesting to see how the storylines potentially could shift from the Myles Garrett, Mason Rudolph fight to, all right, Tomlin versus the Browns receivers and the Pittsburgh Steelers versus the Cleveland Browns, because we did see some big hits in the secondary specifically in this game early on that could, that type of stuff could boil over in a couple weeks.
Yeah, that's right. 17 days is when they play, not really 10, but it's in 2 weeks' time. On the football calendar. You're talking about Demarius Randall, who got the gate for knocking out, I believe, Deontay Johnson last night, and Juju Smith-Schuster also got concussed. He got knocked out of the game. Joe Thomas here on the Rich Eisen show. How do you think Baker Mayfield's comments about right on the spot said it was inexcusable and that we've been hurting ourselves too much around here? That's been sort of been the issue. How do you think those comments make, even though I thought they were spot on and showing a sign of leadership that's required? What do you think, Joe?
Yeah, well, let me quick talk about the hits in the secondary. We talked about Demarius Randall getting the boot for his penalty. Those hits in the secondary, while they were violent and there was some players that got knocked out and thrown out, they were not intentional. There was nobody headhunting. It was one of those things that kind of happened throughout the course of the game when you're playing fast. They were the right calls, certainly, but there was no malicious intent similar to what we saw at the end of the game. And now specifically to what Baker did at the end of the game, I actually thought that was one of the bright moments at the end of the game for the Browns, because Baker Mayfield had an opportunity to kind of brush it under the rug and say, well, wait to see the film. We want to wait and, not rush to judgment on this. But he actually showed me a tremendous amount of leadership, and I think he's got an opportunity to have this team really rally around him with the way he handled it with the media right away, standing up, taking ownership, saying, this is not how we act. This is not who we are as a team. And to me, that was a huge step and could be a pivotal moment in Baker Mayfield's career because of the leadership he showed in that moment.
I thought it was his finest hour, to be honest with you, Joe.
No question. I agree.
And also showed to me that, you could say, sure, he's cocky, confident, all that, but he's confident in his grasp of the locker room that he could be confident in to say something like that, in my mind.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think most quarterbacks probably would sit there and talk in cliches and really give you a non-answer, but he was very definitive. I thought he showed tremendous amount of leadership by standing up and attacking it right away, even though Myles is a good friend, and Myles is one of the leaders on that defense. And for all the people that know Myles, they understand how out of character that play was for him. But to stand up there and say, this is just not acceptable, this is not how we play, he showed that this is his team. And I agree, that was, to me, his finest moment as a quarterback, and it had nothing to do with how he played.
So in the few minutes I have with you left here, Joe, after the game, Freddie Kitchens said this is not what we're about, and the Haslam family just sent out a statement that said the same thing. All that said, do you think any of this is going to wind up at the feet of Freddie Kitchens, talking about undisciplined behavior, talk about not having control, that other coaches, no player would ever consider doing that because they'd be afraid of the ramifications? That's normally what does come with the territory where the first-year head coach has only won 4 out of his first 10 despite the 2-game win streak.
Well, that's going to be part of the learning process for this young Browns roster, and understanding that what you do and the actions that you take on the field have repercussions not only for yourself and your teammates, but your coaches and your organization and your city. Because the message, really, the beginning of the season was Freddie Kitchens doesn't have control of his team because of the undisciplined play, because of the penalties. And they had gotten better in the last 3 weeks with those things. And then to have something like this only adds fuel to the fire of, does Freddie Kitchens have control of this team? Does he have control of these players where they're afraid to act a certain way that hurts the team because they know how hard Freddie Kitchens is going to come down on it? And right, wrong, or indifferent, when there is something like this that happens, that becomes part of the narrative around the team. And I think when I talked to Myles Garrett this morning, I'm in Berea this morning, I got a chance to talk to him. You could see how upset and remorseful he was, not only for his own actions, but how it's affecting everybody around him, not only what he did to Mason Rudolph and how he sparked such an ugly moment at the end of the game, but now the questions that his teammates are going to have to answer about the coaching staff and Freddie Kitchens in particular, because that is a tough narrative to overcome. And when you have something as big and momentous as what we saw at the end of the game, that's just going to only feed to that fire that people, especially people that might not like Freddie as a coach, want to say about him, how he's lost control of that locker room.
Well, okay, so before I let you go, so you saw Myles Garrett this very morning, is what you're saying?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I'm in Cleveland here for the Thursday night game, and I also do the Browns radio show the day after their games. And Myles and I have been friends since he was here as a rookie, and we had some great battles in training camp. And after I hurt my elbow, I wanted to try to help him out as much as I could, because I could see what type of player and person he could be. And so I wanted to help him kind of think like an offensive lineman. So every week I'd give him scouting reports and talk to him about the tackles he was going to face. And you could just see how bad he felt this morning, and talking to him, how he was so remorseful, and that as soon as almost that helmet swing was over and he was laying on the ground, he realized what he had done and how embarrassed he was for himself, for his team, for his family, for everybody around him. And I feel like he's ready to accept the consequences that the NFL just laid out with the indefinite suspension.
Well, it's not just that, too, Joe. I mean, he's going to be public enemy number one for quite some time. And I laced into him, too. And I don't know him all that well. And that's not what I do. That's not why I sit in this chair. That's not how I operate. I know you and I haven't really worked on the same set or the same show. You and I have spoken on the phone, not just here, but, a little bit off the air. That's not what I'm about. I'm not about, I'm going to make some hay and get some clicks on my show by laying into Myles Garrett. I'm genuinely pissed as somebody who's worked at the NFL Network for 16 years. My job is to talk the NFL and hopefully be part of the continuing growth of the sport. It puts everybody in a bad spot and everybody in danger. And it's a terrible, terrible thing for him to have done. I'm trying to just piece it all together. How is he going to handle all that, do you think?
Well, he's struggling with it right now, obviously, dealing with the repercussions, like I mentioned, for everybody in the NFL family, because in the end, we might be competitors on the field, but we're all brothers in this business together, because getting traded, you're signing with new teams, you have friendships that cross across team lines. And when you do something like what Myles did yesterday, it's a bad look for everybody. And I think he's starting to understand the gravity of that situation. And unfortunately for him, I can stand here and say that's not who he is. That's out of character.
Okay.
People that know him can defend him and say that's not who he is. But that's who he was last night, and that's who people that don't know him see him as. And you know what? Your actions become who you are. And so until you change your actions, that's who you're going to be known as. And we can talk about what a great person he is and how this is really one thing on the radar, but it's a huge thing. And you know what? You can only use that excuse about, I'm just not a bad kid, but I ran with bad kids and I was in a bad circle. No, it's about you and personal responsibility and owning up to your actions. And so I think it's now the onus is on Myles to move forward from this and become a better person and prove that that was not him that night.
And so last one for you. When you said to him, did you say to him, like, what happened now that he's half of a day removed from it and the cameras aren't on him? Like, what happened?
Yeah, he was just totally, I think, lost in the moment. Similar to what you heard from Marquise Pouncey, like you black out. I've been involved in, a few locker room type fights, training camp type fights, and you hear guys say that a lot. Like their rage and their anger gets so high, they're not even there. You look at them in the eyes, and there's nothing behind it. They're almost on autopilot, and I believe that's exactly what happened with Myles. But you can tell just from talking with him this morning that he cannot wait to move on beyond this and prove that was just an abomination and totally not who he was. And I believe he's going to do everything he can to try to make this right from this point forward.
Joe, great work last night. Appreciate the call today. Truly. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Rich.
Right back at you. That's Joe Thomas at Joe Thomas73 on Twitter.
For more of The Rich Eisen Show, tune to Audience Channel 239 on DirecTV for free on BR Live or download the Rich Eisen Show app.